gwahanol ardaloedd o Gwynedd, Môn, Gogledd Cymru, Cymru a thu hwnt. Falch iawn o'ch gweld chi. Dwi'n gweld rhai gwyneba. Di fideo pawb ddim ymlaen. Os oes modd rhaid y fideo, rhowch ymlaen. Os ddim, os da chi ddim yn awydd, da ni dall, falle fo rein chi, falle ddim efo'r signal cryfan y byd. Na fo gweld dau wyneb newydd o fanna, lle mae'n neis cael gweld gwyneba pawb os dim bosib. A croeso cynnas i chi yma. Dwi'n mynd i dynnu sylw'n syth bin rwan at y chat, sef yr fforwm trafod sydd yn bosib i ddefnyddio efo rhywbeth fel Zoom. Os oes rhywbeth yn codi efo rhyw ddiffygion, yna defnyddiwch y chat i dynnu sylw. A jyst rhag ofn a problemau efo'r cyfieithydd, dwi'n mynd i ddweud hynna Saesneg. If there are any issues with anything in particular with the translation, just leave a note in the chat forum, and we will try and address it on a one-to-one basis if required, so that you don't feel you've got to interrupt the whole evening if there is any technical issues. By all means, if there are technical issues, let us know. But do bear in mind the chat forum. Wedyn, mae'r chat yna i gael rhyw fath o sgwrs yn y cefndir hefyd, a da ni'n awyddus iawn i chi ddefnyddio hwnna. Ac dwi'n mynd i osod tasg i chi rwan y syth bin, fel fod ni'n cael rhyw fath o syniad pwy sydd yma ac yn lle ydych chi. Felly, fysa chi cystal ar ydych enwa, o lle ydych chi'n ymuno fyny heno yma, lle fod ni'n cael rhyw fath o synwyr daearyddol o lle ydych ni. Ac hefyd, fysa chi mewn brawddeg yn gallu crynhoi pam fod chi wedi ymuno fyny heno, be di'ch diddordeb chi efo'r pwnc Gwlan. Ac efallai wnaethon ni unun bach o sgwrsio yn y chat am hwn, rhywbeth da ni eisiau weld, dydy Elin, ydy bobl yn rhyw fath o rwydweithio pryd mae'r cyflwyniadau yn mynd ymlaen hefyd. Wedyn, rhowch hwnna ar y chat ac o'n i olwg wedyn drwyddo fo nes ymlaen ac darllenwch lle mae'r cyfryngiadau yn deillio honno fo. Dwi'n siarad hyn yma o tu allan i Bangor, o pentref yn o Petal y Bont, wedyn dwi'n gweld y fennau tu ôl i mi, pryd mae'r gola dydd, ac yn siarad o fy swyddfa, sydd yn edrych yn llwyd iawn mae gen i ofn ac yn ddiflas iawn yn y cefndir. Mae gan rhan fwyaf chi gefndir lot mwy diddorol na sgynna fi. Mae hwn yn ail webinar mewn cyfres o 4, ac wythnos dwytha oedd y cyntaf, lle gafon ni amser efo Jennifer Hunter. A dwi'n gweld fod Jennifer yn ymuno fyny heno yma, a da iawn gweld chdi, Jen, diolch am ymuno efo ni. Ac wnaethon ni sgwrsio am waith, nath Jennifer a Mina i wneud gynharach llynadd ar y diwydiant Gwlan yng Ngwynedd, ac yn benodol yn edrych ar yr her o gael cyfleusterau i sgwrio neu i lanhau y Gwlan. Felly, dwi'n gwybod na llawer mwy di mynd fyny heno, ac mi oeddan ni yn y sesiwn cyntaf yn ymlygu fo modd i rywun cael copi o'r adroddiad drwy gysylltu efo Elin, elin@mentermon.com, ydy e-bost Elin, elin@mentermon.com, os eisiau copi o'r adroddiad yna. A nath hwnnw unun trafodaeth. Pwrpas y gwebinara ydy dod y syniadau a persbectifs gwahanol i'r sialens neu'r her anferthol sydd yn gwynebu ardaloedd gwledig o ran y diffyg gwerth ariannol mewn Gwlan. Os oedd ddim dwywaith hwnna gwerth o ran Gwlan fel deunydd, da ni gyd, swn i'n tybio, os da ni'n gwybod rhywbeth am Gwlan, yn gwybod pa mor ryfeddol ydy Gwlan fel ffeibr, ac o hynny'n dod yn glir yn trafodaeth Jennifer wythnos dwytha, pa mor amryddawn ydy Gwlan fel ffeibr. Heddiw yma, da ni'n mynd i gael 2 persbectif o gyfeiriad amaethyddol, 2 deulu, 2 berson o gefndir amaethyddol sydd wedi ac yn parhau i gisio taclo'r her yma o chwanegu gwerth i Gwlan. Yn ymuno o Trawsfynydd, mae Elfed Jones, ac efallai sa Elfed rhoi llaw i fyny, na ni Elfed, da iawn, ac yn ymuno fyny o Cwm Rhysor o Trawsfynydd, ac wedyn, yn bach pellach na hynny, mae gynna ni teulu yr Henrys, mae gynna ni Rachel, Joe Henry, ac hefyd Sarah Henry. Mae hwnnw'n codi llaw ar ddyn rwan, mae hwnnw'n ymuno fyny o Northumberland o gwmni Raburn Wool. Felly mewn munud fydda ni'n clywed mwy am y 2 fusnas a'r 2 ymdrech yna, ac y ffordd da ni'n mynd i wneud hyn ydy da ni'n mynd i cael clywed gan Elfed i gychwyn. Mi fydd modd i chi ofyn cwestiynau perthnasol Elfed wedi sgwrs Elfed, fydd o ddeutu 20 munud. Wedyn fydda ni'n mynd at Raburn Wool a cael sgwrs efo nhw am 20 munud, a mae hynny'n mynd i adael o gwmpas 1/4 awr i 1/2 awr yn diwedd os oes a sgyrsiau. A da ni anelu gloi y sesiwn heno am 1/2 awr wedi 8. Felly dyna'r nod am heno. Wedyn, na i amlygu hefyd sesiwn wythnos nesaf ar un amser. Ac o'n i'n meddwl cyn mynd yn fyw ar hwn, mae'r byd wedi newid yn sylweddol iawn ers nos Lun dwytha. A i ddim i fideo dweud os yw gwaith, yma le fi ar y sylwadau, a mae'r byd yn newid, a tybed be wedi digwydd eto mewn wythnos pryd o'n i'n cwrdd nos Lun nesaf, lle mae yna arbenigwyr yn ymuno fyny Gareth Jones o British Wool, Courtney Pye, sef prif weithredwr World Testing Authority yn Caernarfon, a wedyn mae gennym ni Graham Ormondroed o'r ganolfan biogyfansoddion yn Brifysgol Bangor yn ymuno fyny. Lle golwg mwy ymchwiliol neu mwy academaidd wythnos nesaf, a fydd y sesiwn ola wedyn y pedwerydd yn drafodaeth neu fforwm agored i bobl rannu syniadau, ac yma arloesi Gwynedd Wledig ac arloesi Môn yn chwilio am syniadau i'w pilota dros y misoedd nesaf. Felly yn y sesiwn ola, gobeithio fydda ni cael rhyw fath o canolbwynt o ran be di'r syniadau sydd yn fwyaf adawol i wneud ardrawiad ar yr her yma. Reit, dwi'n mynd i basio rhywun mewn munud i Elfed, ac diolch Elin am ganiatáu mi weithio ar hwn ac i gynllunio'r webinara. Ac mae Elfed wedi cychwyn menter y ddiweddar Gwlan Gwynedd a Môn, ac yn amserol iawn mae yma i drafod be di'r gwaith sydd wedi mynd ymlaen ar hyd y hyn a be di'r planiau a'r cynlluniau ar gyfer y dyfodol. Felly, cyn fi ofyn Elfed, diolch i chi am eich sylwadau ar yr chat. Mi gael olwg drwy yn y rwan i weld o lle da ni gyd. Dwi'n gweld y sydyn amrywiol lefydd a mae'n ddiddorol gweld beth i'ch diddordeb chi fel gwlad. Felly, Elfed, os gai basio rywun drosodd i ti am yr 20 munud nesaf, a wedyn yr anogaeth ola, defnyddiwch y chat i siarad efo'ch gilydd hefyd yn ystod y sesiwn yma. Drosodd i ti, Elfed. Diolch o galon.
Gwych, diolch o'r geraint. Os oedd dda, Elfed Jones dwi, a dwi'n dod o Benter nhw'r taws fyny. Just a gofn i'r we fynd, mae ddeuwch i fi, ddim colli ddiddordeb ydw i, ond mae'r we yn tueddu bod yn dodgy yn y rhan yma o Gymru. Felly, os dwi yn mynd ffwrdd, peidiwch â panicio, jyst cariwch ymlaen hebddo fi tan i fi ddod nôl. Dwi jyst mynd i rannu'n sgrin efo chi wan, mwyn i chi weld yw gyflwyniad wedi paratoi eisoes. Ydy pawb yn gallu gweld hwn rwan? Ydy? Felly, i ddechrau lle. Reit, present. Lle mae present hwnna? Reit, dyma, i ddechrau, jyst rhoi bach o gefndir iddo chi. Tua 4-5 mis yn ôl, o'n i wedi meddwl am sefydlu cwmni neu ryw fenter, neu hyd o jyst meddwl casglu bach o syniadau, bach o waith ymchwil at ei gilydd, ar be i wneud efo Gwlan. O'n i'n cneifio rhyw ddafad andros o ryff, ac o'n i'n meddwl, ydy hyn werth o, ydy o werth am y pris fyddai'n gael am y cnif y ddafad yma yn y pen draw, neu fedra i ffeindio ffordd ar yn fferm i, neu wneud rhyw gwmni neu rhyw fenter fysa'n ychwanegu gwerth, hydod i'r ddafad mwyaf carpiog swn i'n ei chreifio. A mae'n siŵr ta 4 mis yn ôl o ffawd, dwi'n meddwl na ffawd oedd ond yna rhyw gyfla i fi fynd ar ryw brosiect o'r enw efo byw prosiect oedd yn cael ei ariannu gan Menter Môn ac arloesi Gwynedd Wledig o'r enw Byw a Bod. A pwrpas y brosiect yma oedd i greu rhywbeth o'n i'n meddwl oedd yn mynd i ychwanegu gwerth neu mynd i helpu'r gymdeithas. A penderfynais i mae'r ffordd ymlaen oedd mynd ati ddatblygu rhywbeth efo Gwlan. A dyma y cyflwyniad nes i wneud i'r prosiect. A yna jyst dipyn bach o waith ymchwil dim ymlaen ac waith yna bwyllgor i ddat ei gilydd ers hynny, ond na i ddanos y cyflwyniad i chi wan. Reit. Cyflwyniad, jyst rhoi bach o gefndir i chi. Dyma pwy ydw i. Dwi'n ffarmio'n nghwmbrysor ac defaid sgennau'n benodol dwi'n arbrofi bach efo ryw ieir a ryw warthag a bethau fel yna. Ond dyma ni. Na i sgipio ddi gwir y darn prosiect Byw a Bod. Ond dyma beth o'r her o'n i eisiau gwynebu. O'n i eisiau defnyddio Gwlan i wneud adnoddau gwahanol. Ac be o'n i'n sylwi fod costau cnifio'n uchel a Gwlan a pris Gwlan wedi bod mor isel. A hynna'n cynnwys oherwydd y coronavirus. Ac o'n i'n sylwi na lot o ffermwyr rwan, dwi'n siŵr fod ni wedi gweld ar y we fod yna llawer iawn wedi bod yn llosgi gwlan yn ddiweddar. Ond o'na lawer iawn o wlan yn mynd i wastraff. Ffermwyr jyst yn gadael o'i bydru yn y caeau weithiau. A o'na rhai ffermwyr o'n i'n siarad efo'n gweld fod cneifio dafad yn fwy o gosb na wbath oedd yn wneud gwerth. Lle. Ac i gymharu fo 100 mlynedd yn ôl pan fysa cneifio diadell o ddefad wedi gallu talu rhent i rywun. Oedd o'n mewn draw wahanol iawn i gymharu fo wan. Ac o'n i'n sylweddoli hefyd, dwi'n siarad efo ffrindiau a bobl wedi gwneud, di bod yn meddwl wneud prosiectau yma o blaen, ond o neb wedi brathu'r bwled a mynd ati sefydlu rhywbeth iawn yn yr ardal yma eto i ddelio ag hyn. Ac y datrysiad oedd sefydlu Gwlan Gwynedd y Môn a Gwlan Cymru. A sef y penderfyniad o greu cwmni cydweithredol gyda 4 rhanbarth yng Nghymru. Dwi'n dechrau gyda Gwlan Gwynedd a Môn fatha'r rhanbarth cyntaf a y busnes cyntaf. A mae hwnna'n dod o dan yn barel yn y pen draw Gwlan Cymru, fydd yn cynnwys 4 rhanbarth sef Gwlan Dyfed, Gwlan Clwyd a Gwlan Gwent y Morgannwg. A y pwrpas fysa defnyddio'r adnoddau ni'n cymunedau ni, sef fysa Gwlan Gwynedd y Môn yn defnyddio Gwlan Defaid yng Ngwynedd a hefyd defnyddio Gwlan yn Ynys Môn ffwrna i wneud y cynnyrch yma. A hefyd i ymchwilio i'r pethau gwahanol sy'n gallu defnyddio'r gwlan iddo ynde. Y syniadau sydd wedi dod gyda Gwlan Gwynedd y Môn ar hyn o bryd ydy defnyddio'r gwlan tocio ar y gwlan sy'n cael ei daflu ffwrdd fel arfer i wneud compost. Cymysgu fo gyda bach o redyn, gyda bach o wymon a raddfa gwahanol lle a wneud compostau gwahanol. A y datblygiad arall fysa gwneud insiwleiddiau tai. O'na llawer iawn o sôn wedi bod gyda Llywodraeth Cymru yn mynd i ddefnyddio gwlan i insiwleiddio adeiladau cyhoeddus yn ddiweddar. A wedyn fysa hwnna'n gallu bod yn rhywbeth arall sy'n gallu bod yn ddefnydd da iawn i'r gwlan. Ac yn y pen draw, edrych yn hir dymor ar ddyfodol y cwmni wan, fysa defnyddio gwlan i wneud pethau fel carthenni, sana ac llawer iawn o beth eraill ar yr ochr ffasiynol. Un o'r prif pwrpesi hefyd o sefydlu'r cwmni yma fysa adfywio'r hen ddiwydiant yng Nghymru ac sy'n gwneud gwlan eto'n gongylfaen unwaith eto i'r economi ac datblygu'r economi drwy greu swyddi'n lleol ac rhoi mwy o arian ym mhocedi ffermwyr. Ac os ni'n cydweithio gyda'r bwrdd gwlan pethau mwyn gallu cyrraedd hynny. Just y ffyrdd positif sy'n effeithio ar y gymuned, fatha ni'n dweud, codi safon byw ffermwyr. Mae'r amgylchedd yn rhywbeth mor bwysig sydd wedi codi mor bwysig yn y blynyddoedd dwytha. A fysa'n help mwyn tynnu llawer iawn o'r fiberglass a bethau sy'n cael ei ddefnyddio wan a hefyd defnyddio rhywbeth yn lleol. So'n rhywbeth cael ei gynhyrchu o fewn yr ardal leol i'r ardal leol. So'n help i'r economi. Ac hefyd, un o'r pethau niche o'n eisiau gwneud o fewn y cwmni oedd rhoi hwb i sgiliau traddodiadol sydd mor brin y dyddiau yma gen llawer, sef wrth wneud carthenni Cymreig, fysa yna bris penodol i garthenni sydd wedi cael ei greu o wlan, sydd wedi cael ei gneifio efo gwella, enghraifft. Bod ni'n dod ar sgiliau yna yn ôl drwy adeiladu rhyw ddarn pendant o'r cwmni fysa'n gallu gwneud bydd efo lle. A jyst y pethau dwi wedi dweud yn hyn, fel cynllun busnes fi ddechrau, wedi dewis bwrdd o swyddogion hyn o bryd. Mae'r logo, o'na 100 holiaduron chwarae teg oedd heina di llenwi fyny'n gyflym iawn, bobl yn frwdfrydig iawn efo hynny. Wedi bod yn edrych ar yr safle ffatio gwmpas Gwllan Ffestiniog a wedi bod yn siarad gyda un y ddau yn falle wbath ochr Pwllheli pan mae'n datblygu. Ac mae yna bapurau gwaith wedi'w ryddhau. Jyst yn sôn yn fras beth yw'r cwmni. Os ydych chi eisiau gweld o, digon hapus i rannu fo wedyn efo chi. Felly, jyst dweud y bwriadau nesaf sgynna i fo hyn, di cwblhau'r cynllun busnes a gobeithio mynd ymgeisio am grantiau erbyn y Nadolig ac hefyd gweithio gyda'r tîm i... O'n i fod i gael cyfarfod heno, i ddweud gwir, ond nes i anghofio fod hwn ymlaen. Felly, mae hwnna wedi cael ei shiftio ymlaen i'r wythnos nesaf. Ond, dyn ni eisiau paratoi'r strategaeth marchnad a hefyd, dwi wedi bod yn ymchwilio drwy ffonio canolfannau garddio gwahanol gweld beth yw barn nhw ar hyn. Llawer iawn dyn nhw'n ffafriol yn dweud fod nhw'n cefnogi'r fenter oherwydd fod o'n rhywbeth sy'n defnyddio cynnyrch lleol, sy'n defnyddio pethau gwyrdd ac hefyd fysa na frand frai goch yn fo sydd oedd yn tynnu sylw llawer iawn o bobl. Oedd yn anhygoel faint o effaith oedd y syniad o gael rhyw gynnyrch Cymreig yn gael a llawer iawn o fusnesau ni'n cysylltu efo nhw. Ac just deud beth sy'n angen hyn o bryd, sef grantiad i'r peth mwyaf dyn ni'n mynd i fo'n chwilio amdano fo. Dyn ni jyst adeiladu sylfaen gyntaf drwy wneud yr cynllun busnes, gael hwnna'n orffenedig, a wedyn fedrwn ni symud ymlaen i gael grantiau cyn y flwyddyn newydd gobeithio. Felly, dyna ddiwedd y cyflwyniad. Dyna logo Gwlan Cymru'n top, dyna Gwlan Gwynedd hwnna, dyna rhyw ddafad i reidus, rhyw oen i reidus oedd o gwmpas y ffarm yn fanna oedd yn ffotogenic iawn. Dyna ni, na i jyst fynd yn ôl i gael os hwn yn gweithio. Dyna ni. Ac jyst dyna chi fras beth ydy'r cwmni, gobeithio creu, y pwrpas nes i ddechrau fod i ddweud y gwir ydy, dwi'n licio gweld, dwi wedi gweld diriwiad yn y gymuned yn 20 mlynedd dwytha, jyst efo llawer iawn o bethau. Ac mae o'n rhywbeth fedrwn ni droi ar ei ben, lle fedrwn ni droi rhywbeth sy'n cael ei weld fel broblem ar hyn o bryd. Mae o'n rhywbeth fydd yn creu ac yn ail-danio rwsut y diwydiant yng Nghymru a rhoi hwb mawr i'r economi yn lleol. A gobeithio rhywbeth fydd yn datblygu dros Gymru yn diwedd ac yn dod o bydd i pob ffarmwr ac hefyd pawb fysa'n gweithio i'r cwmni. Felly, unrhyw gwestiynau ewch amdani ynde.
Diolch o galon Elfed am rhoi'r cronodeb yna o beth sydd wedi digwydd a beth sydd ar y gweill a'r planiau cyffroes gen ti i taclo'r heria yma. Mae'r her yn cael ei fframio mewn sawl ffordd, mae reid efo eisiau chwanegu gwerth, reid efo eisiau ffordd i ffermwyr o well, reid efo yn wendid yn y farchnad ar gadw'n gyflwynwy, mae'n her cymlath iawn, ond mae'n ddiddorol gweld sy'n mae bobl yn ymateb. Dwi'n mynd i brynu chydig bach amser fel bod modd i chi darwch cwestiynau i Elfed, a sa'n ni'n gofyn cwestiynau penodol i Elfed cyn fod ni'n agor i drafodaeth cyffredinol ar y diwedd. Os yna elfennau o gynlluniau Elfed, fysa chi'n licio fo amylaethu neu cwestiynau, yna nodwch hynny ar y chat, neu fe modd i chi godi'ch llaw. Dwi'n meddwl ar hyn o bryd dwi'n gweld pawb sydd efo camera ymlaen. Os ydych chi eisiau holi cwestiwn yna, rhowch arwydd ym mi rywsut. Codi'ch llaw ydy'r arferiad ym mwyn i. Diolch o galon Elfed. Na i jyst ofyn un cwestiwn cyn gweld rhagor o gwestiynau. Fysa ti'n meindio rhoi y ffordd gorau o gysylltu efo chdi lawr ar y chat, boed o'n e-mail neu yn rhif ffôn symudol, sa ti'n gwneud hynny rhyw dro cyn diwedd y noson, rhag ofyn am rei bobl eisiau cysylltu a trafod y bellach efo chdi. Mae gennym ni gwestiwn gan Stephen Briggs. A'r cwestiwn ydy, is each area its own cooperative company?
Diolch yn fawr, Stephen, am y cwestiwn. Ac dyna di'r gobaith yn y pen draw, fod pob ardal, fysa ni'n datblygu bob ardal i anghenion ei hun. Mae bob ardal yng Nghymru yn unigryw ac yn gallu cynnig pethau gwahanol. Ac hefyd, fysa ni'n gallu defnyddio model Gwlan Gwynedd wedyn a'i siapio fo i'r ffordd fydd angen o mwyn ardal tha Clwyd ac mwyn ardal tha Dyfed a Gwent am Organwg. A fysa na 4 cooperative wedyn yn dod o dan Gwlan Cymru. Dyna ydy'r gobaith yn y pen draw.
Diolch yn galon Elfed. A wedyn y tai tarian Mair, gofyn, Has there been any resistance from the British Marketing Board forming this cooperative approach? And have you begun setting up any of the processing factory yet for wool insulation?
Fantastic, diolch yn fawr Tai. A naddoch, dwi wedi bod yn cydweithio gyda nhw, dwi wedi bod mewn trafodaeth da iawn efo ges i sgwrs da efo Gareth a efo Hyw yn ddiweddar, ac o'n i jyst wedi bod yn trafod be oedd amcan yn y cwmni ac yr ffordd o'r ymlaen fysa i ni gydweithio trafod efo'n gilydd. O'n i wedi bod yn edrych ar yr opsiynau wahanol o weithio hefyd, enghraifft sy'n ni'n gallu prynu gwlan gen y bwrdd, neu sy'n ni'n gallu cael trwydded mwyn prynu gwlan. Felly, nos o ddim gwrthwynebiad wedi bod, maen nhw wedi bod yn gefnogol iawn efo fi, chwarae teg. Ac hefyd, sori, jyst o'n newid sylw yn ail cwestiwn o fewn y cwestiwn. And have you begun setting? Na, nos yn byd wedi cael ei osod yn benodol eto, ond mae'r cynlluniau wedi bod yn dechrau gael ei wneud. Felly dwi wedi bod yn trafod efo'r tîm. Achos y gol i ddechrau oedd adeiladu'r busnes compost yma, a wedyn yr ail gam ar ôl hwnna gael ei sylfaenu fysa ni'n adeiladu y busnes insiwleiddiad, a unwaith fysa hwnna yn solat, fysa ni'n adeiladu y busnes ffasiwn a'r carthenni, sana. Ond ar ôl cyfarfod y tîm trwytha, oedden nhw'n dweud fod o'n beth pwysig iddyn ni ddechrau yr compostio a'r insiwleiddiad yn un amser. Felly, dyn ni wedi bod yn trafod fatha tîm sut dyn ni'n mynd ati. Mae yna ddipyn o feisydd o gwmpas Gwynedd y Môn dyn ni wedi bod yn edrych arnyn nhw, ac yn diwadd fydd o'n fusnes aml safle ar ôl dechrau yn Blaenau Ffestiniog, ac yn mynd llun gobeithio, gyn i weld sy'n mynd am mynd. Ond mae pethau yn y dyddiau cynnar ar hyn o bryd, bydd pethau lot cliriach unwaith mae'r cynllun busnes wedi'i wneud, ac o'n i symud ymlaen wedyn o nerth i nerth, ynddi.
Siwr na lot digonedd o gefnogaeth i'r syniad ac i'r nod a'r ddechrog. Diolch o galon Elfed. Dwi'n meddwl, nawn ni oedi fanna, ac wedyn gwahodd Sarah, Rachel a Joe i baratoi i rhoi eu cyflwyniad nhw, a wedi gael ni drafodaeth agorad wedyn ar ôl clod mwy am Mae Raburn Wool. Mae yna naws gwlanog i'r cyfarfod yma, dwi'n gweld yn rhaid gweu ar y pryd, a mae hwnna wrach yn her i mi siapio erbyn wythnos nesaf, mae ddim gweu neu rhywbeth fwy perthnasol, mae yna garthenni bendigedig yn y cefndir hefyd, felly yna fod da iawn, felly mae wrach yn rhywbeth i ni feddwl erbyn y pedwerydd sesiwn neu fod rhaid i gyd fod yn rhywbeth mwy creadigol efo gwlan ar ddechrog, ac mae yna 520 yn ymuno efo ni heno yma, sydd yn adlewyrchiad o'r diddordeb, dwi'n meddwl, ac dwi'n gweld sawl enw cyfarwydd a gwyneb cyfarwydd oedd yn y sesiwn wythnos dwytha. Felly mae'n ardderchog i gwir, achos nac i bobl dod at ei gilydd, yna sy'n gobaith i cael syniadau i ddigwydd. Ac dyna, ac mae'n wrth gwrs yn anodd ar hyn o bryd efo'r cyfyngiadau, ond mae'r technoleg mae'n caniatau ni wneud pethau sydd efallai ddim yn arferol, ac un o'r heini ydy gofyn i berson, i cwmni, bydda'n wrach fydda ni'n teimlo'n uog, gofyn yn nhw deithio holl ffordd i Ngwynedd neu Môn, yna mae'n llawer haws gofyn iddyn nhw'n ymuno efo ni dros y Zoom, ac mi dynwyd sylw cwmni Raburn Wool i ni, gan aelod o'r lag, ac wedyn mi da ni wedi lag ydy'r grŵp gweithredol tu ôl i ymdrechion arloesi Gwynedd Wledig, ac mi gafon ni groeso cynnes iawn gan y teulu Henry a parodrwydd i rannu profiadau, ac ymuno fydd heno mae brawd y chwaer, Sarah a Joe Henry, a wedyn Rachel a Joe gŵr y gwraig. A dwi ar ddall fod Joe yn milfeddyg sydd ar alw, felly os ydy'r galwad yn dod, mi fydd Joe yn gadael ni ac mi fydd a da ni'n cario ymlaen wrth gwrs efo Rachel a Sarah. Felly mae di addo ni, ddim yn ni sydd wedi pechu, mae wedi cael ei alw allan fydd o. Wedyn, mae'n basio'r awynau drosodd felly, so thank you Sarah, Rachel and Joe for joining us. I will now pass
thank you very much.
Proceedings on to you, Sarah, for the next 20 minutes or so. I'm just going to let you know, we're slightly ahead of time, so just so that you can take it relaxed.
I think that's going to be the challenge, will be to not continue talking about wool, because there's so many interesting things to discuss. But thank you very much for inviting us along here. Noswaith da. We're very happy to be able to discuss wool with so many people from around the country as well. So I'm Sarah, and this is also my brother Joe and his wife Rachel. And together we, I'll try and share the screen. Together we run Raburn Wool, which is based in Northumberland. And Joe and Rachel have run the cattle and sheep farm for probably nearly 20 years. Is that about right, Joe?
Yeah.
It's really only quite recently that Raburn Wool was set up. It was set up in 2015 as a way to sort of diversify into wool, because we're all really keen enthusiasts of wearing wool and using it, and that it's just a brilliant material to have. Let me see if this will go to the next slide. Yes, so it started in 2015, but as I said, Joe has had the farm for a lot longer. Joe and Rachel have had the farm for a lot longer, and I remember going back years when it was shearing time, going and helping, and Joe would be loudly complaining about the price of wool, and that he wouldn't really get as much to even pay the shearers. And I'm a really keen knitter, so I knew that there was a bit of a disconnect, because to buy real wool, balls of yarn to knit it's quite expensive. And so there was someone in the middle who was doing the scouring and the dyeing and the spinning, was doing quite well out of it. And I used to sort of say, oh, I'd quite like to learn how to spin. And my brother Joe, in true big brother style, would joke and say, if you start spinning, you'll never get married. So which put me off for a little while, but not for long, thankfully. So so I took up spinning to use wool. And Raburn Wool sort of began out of this interest in wool, really, from all of us. I should point out, though, that we all have full-time jobs. So Joe is a vet, Rachel is a teacher, and I'm a scientist. So Raburn Wool has sort of evolved from the time that we can spend to commit to it, really. So there's lots more things there's lots more directions it could go, but we've tended to go in the sort of hand spinning route because that's what has ended up being of interest, I suppose, to us. But there's lots of different routes and uses for wool. And it started off with just 10 Polwarth merino sheep. But as I say, Joe has had Hampshires and Romneys for quite a long time. I'll hand over in a few minutes to Joe and Rachel, and they can talk a bit more about the farm side of things as well. So see if this will go to the next one. So we're all keen enthusiasts of wool. It wasn't until, and I've always been a knitter, it wasn't until I went to America that I learned to spin. I was really fortunate. I lived in Arizona, where in the desert there's really no need to have any there's no need to have any wool jumpers or anything, but in Arizona there's loads of people that love spinning and love to knit. I was really fortunate. I had spent a weekend. There was a local craft shop that was in the small town in Phoenix that I lived in, where they had a whole variety of spinning wheels and loads of knitting stuff. And I bought a spindle on the spur of a moment one weekend and a bag of fluff, and went home and started to learn to spin. And even though I've been a knitter for a long time, it wasn't until I learned to spin that I appreciated that there's so many different varieties to the different types of wool, and from the different breeds. And we're so fortunate in the UK to have so many breeds of sheep, with different types of locks and different ways to use their wool. Whilst I was in Arizona, the knitting shop set up for me to go and spend a weekend with the Navajo weavers in the north of Arizona. And this was one of the best weekends I've had. It was to see how, and to have the translation as well of how spinning wool for carpets in the Navajo tradition was an absolutely essential connection that they had to their ancestry, to their culture, their language, their religion, and the stories and the myths were all completely interwoven with their use of wool. And they predominantly use a kind of sheep called the Churro Sheep. It's a primitive wool. It's got about 6 horns. The sheep look really amazing, actually, and it has different layers of fiber to the fleece, and every single bit of it was used. So even the guard hairs, which were quite tough and coarse, even those were used, and they were made, I think it was something like an 8 or a 9 ply wool that was a yarn that was really tough, and they used to use that like we would use chain to kind of hold gates locked and closed, because it was so tough, and you wouldn't be able to cut through it. So I really admired how the fact that they used every bit of the wool, so it wasn't a waste product. Every part of it was sustainable. So anyway, so I came back from Arizona and with a real enthusiasm for spinning wool, and spent some time in Northumberland with my brother and his wife and their family, and discussed the fact that there could be a need for, there was a demand for wool from sheep that was just for hand spinners, that had been prepared and scoured and skirted even for wool spinners. And a lot of the merino wool fleece comes over, it gets imported from quite far away from Australia, and they have mulesing in some of these countries. So to have British Polworth or merino wool that was very fine wool, there was a market for that. So that's what we sort of aimed at. And also knowing that it was very popular in America too, meant that we could market some of the wool a lot more towards America, because they're really keen crafters there. So using groups on Ravelry and things like that made it also easier to be able to sell wool there. We set up a website as well, and people find us that way by searching for fleece and fibre that's UK based. And we also go quite a lot to wool festivals, which is a great way to meet other wool enthusiasts and sell fleeces because there's space to be able to see a whole variety of different fleeces, whether it be fine wool or coarse wool or alpaca wool, all kinds of different kinds. And there's also, amongst hand spinners, there's a real demand for coloured fleeces as well. So they sell like hotcakes, because you don't need to dye them to quite the same extent. So that's how it sort of started off, just with these few sheep and going to wool festivals, and it's just sort of grown from there. The way that we try to add value to the wool is, as I said, is we prepare the wool with hand spinners in mind, and we quite heavily skirt each of the fleeces because it's sold by weight. So we don't want any bits of twig or anything else that's sort of nasty that's in there, because it will change the weight and then people aren't getting the full value. So they're very well skirted to remove any of the dags and things like that, and bits of grass. Second cuts also are really, that's what makes any jumpers sort of bobbly if in the final product once it's spun. So we remove those, and we also try and make sure that there's not so much paint on the sheep for the hand spinning, for the fine wool. And each of those fleeces is then, we photograph them, we describe them, and give suggestions on how to spin them. So this is an example from the website where there's a couple of fleeces. We normally have about 10 fleeces at a time there, and describe each of the fleeces, and also give a way of being able to give some suggestions of how best to wash it or prepare it. Because there's different ways to prepare that maybe people like, and that allows us to be able to communicate kind of directly to the people that are buying the fleeces as well. So that's also really helped us. I'm going to hand over to Joe and Rachel now to talk a bit more about the farm side of Raburn Wool.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. So just from our perspective, Rachel and I spent a year in New Zealand and got to see. I was a farm vet there. And the New Zealanders love wool. This is in the year after foot and mouth 2002, and get to see how it's used in loads of different clothings and the felts and stuff like that. When we came back to Northumberland, we were fully bought into that. We bought, at the time, the New Zealand dollar was very weak compared to the pound, so rather than bring back New Zealand dollars, we actually bought back a trunk full of different wool clothing in all its forms: merino, icebreakers for wearing next to the wool, felted next to the skin, felted swan dries for very tough, hard-wearing garments and such like. We originally got some Hampshire sheep, Hampshire down, and some Romneys, and our philosophy is very much a low input, based on sort of New Zealand philosophies, forage based, nothing's ever housed, lambs outside, it lives on grass and silage, our whole thing is trying to be sustainable and grow as much on the farm as possible, not have to buy in very much. And we got involved with the ethics of wool to a certain extent, in that we went to St David's down in Pembrokeshire, which is obviously West Wales. Tremendous mills, love what they do with the wool wear, and yet quite a lot of it was imported wool, especially the softer stuff that was meant to be wearing nearer to the skin, from Australia, Falkland Islands, New Zealand, and same with Harris tweed, up in the islands and it's just a bit of a shame really that we've got so much wool in this country, and yet a lot of it is the lower value, coarser wool for carpets and such like. So Sarah, if you just move on the screen, please. Yeah, so we had about 250 Romneys and their crosses, Romney cross clins. The Romney's a great sheep from a wool point of view. I mean, it's a great sheep altogether because it's good to shepherd, it's very motherly, it milks quite well, it's quite a good bodied sheep. But a Romney will clip about 3 kilos of wool, Romney ewe that is, which is obviously quite a bit more than the standard mule that is more common around this part of the world, which maybe only clip 1.5 kilos of wool. So often the wool, it's only this year really that wool's been less than £1,000 a ton, which always, and yet it's been treated like a waste product by a lot of British farms, so much so that they try and breed away from wool to have as little wool as possible. And then it always seems slightly ironic to me that then when actually you're only clipping 1 kilo or 1.5 kilos of wool off the sheep, it doesn't pay for the shearers because you're only getting £1.50 back. Obviously this year prices are absolutely horrendous and that's even less. Whereas we've always clipped sort of £4 worth, £5 worth of wool off the Romneys. So it's paid for the shearing and also the fly treatments and such like. So, and very much the sheep, I think, should be dual purpose. We shouldn't just be looking at the meat characteristics. We should be looking at the wool characteristics as well as the meat characteristics, because that is the other strength of their bow. So we had these sheep, just shy of 300 ewes, and then Sarah comes back from America, all enthused about wool, and we thought, well, we're quite keen on wool. Let's see what we can find in the fine wool sort of side of things. And there was very little fine wool sheep in this country. We did find some Polworths, which are an Australian breed based on 3/4 merino, 1/4 Lincoln long wool. And the idea there was the straight merinos, and a merino encompasses lots of different types of merino, but the straight merinos can get effective in a humid climate with more fleece rot and wool rot, lumpy wool and such like. The Polworths are more resistant. So even though this part of the world, Northumberland, we're quite a dry area of the country, we only get about 27 inches of rain a year here on average. We thought they'd be good, and there's been an Australian farmer over here and he'd left, and this lady had bought the sort of last remaining Polworths. So the wool, as I say, just in terms of treating it like a nice thing, it's amazing around here. Most farms are quite mixed, and the grain sheds are swept out, power washed out, swept out, kept really spotlessly clean, and the wheat is only worth £120 a ton. And yet where they're clipping the sheep, There's bits of straw, there's dirty old stuff lying around, and yet it's worth sort of 10 times the value of the corn, and yet is not treated anything like as specially. So Sarah, if we just go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is our sheep. This is one time of the year they get put under a roof just before scanning. So this is sort of shows the motley crew of our sheep. So we've got in the foreground there, bottom right hand side, there's a couple of Polworths. You can see they're merino, basically merino sheep. We've got pink noses. Yeah, pink noses and floppy lugs. They are not robust sheep. They're not like the Romney or the Clin or Hampshire really, in that they're reasonably they're not that low input. You know, if anything's going to go lame, they will. They're quite motherly, but they're not roughy tufty. So they're behind them. You've got a real Romney head there, and then bottom left hand side of the screen, you've got some of the Romney cross Clins, a much tighter fleece, bit more Clinny head and face, and then there's some further back, there's some Hampshires in among them. You can see with the black faces, but yeah. So that's sort of some of the mix of our sheep really. That's why we put that up there, that photo. Right, go to the next one, please. Yeah, so it started with those 10 Polworths. The gene pool is quite small in this country, so after a wee while, we've sort of exhausted all the Polworths, getting very into bred, and so we got a Corriedale, which is from Wales, and Corriedale's a half merino, half Lincoln long wool, and put that over the Polworths. And then a couple of years ago, we managed to get an actual merino, an Estlan, which is like a meat type of merino that had been imported from eastern France, and he's a very big sheep. And so we keep just crossing all these fine wool sheep together. In terms of the fleece, often the fine wool, the Polworths and their crosses are about 24, 25 microns. We have actually crossed quite a few with the Romneys to try and get a bigger amount of fleece, because the Romneys clip quite a lot of wool. And in terms of volume, you know, if you put a Polworth tup on 30 Romneys, then you can very quickly get into quite a lot of kilos of wool the following year. And the microns for the Romney cross or the Polworth cross Romney about 28, so still a lot finer than a lot of British wools, but not as fine as the straight fine wools. So at the moment, there's more and more interest in British wool. We've had people phoning up from all over the country. I think people are looking since the pandemic at more local things and sustainability, and there's companies, you know, Finisterre will only use British merino wool. We were phoned up. They wanted one of our sheep in an advert in London a couple of weeks ago, because there's a company that uses merino wool in their shoe adverts. So we think it's a growing thing, you know, the fine wool really. Yeah, just yeah, and Brexit might help, because it means in terms of getting genetics in from other parts of the world, because when we're part of the EU, it's actually very difficult to buy. The biggest problem with the fine wool side in Britain, as far as we can see, is very few actual different bloodlines, and it's getting quite tricky there's not very many. So we've sold fine wool sheep to various parts of the country, but we're getting really to sort of the end in terms of finding new blood to come in. We now have about 40 fine wool sheep, like pure ones, of various Polworths and such like that. But hopefully, like, we'll be able to get sheep in from the Falkland Islands more easily after January the 1st. So just go to the next slide, please, Sarah.
That's a good picture, that.
Yeah, so that's the top of the hill, basically, where we farm, sort of looking across the Coquet Valley, looking across the Cheviot Hills, which is Scotland. Basically, Scotland's on the skyline there. They're covered. So that's yeah, again, that's just sort of getting. So you can see these sheep do have to work for a living. They're not too mollycoddled, and that, yeah, that's them sort of late winter out on the hill. Starting to get some grass pellets, I would imagine.
Sorry.
So Great, yeah. So that's our story, really. Yeah. Any questions?
Yes, thank you, Joe and Rachel and Sarah for giving us that, sort of summarised version of your story so far. And I would encourage everybody tonight to have a look at your website, which is raburnwool.co.uk. And there's a lot of information on the actual produce as well. So maybe I'll encourage straight away questions now, specifically for your story, your experience, and just reminding everyone that the aim tonight is to better understand your experience, what's worked, what hasn't worked so well, and likewise with Elfed as well. So maybe if I could just ask one question to kick off, could you just explain how you sell the whole fleeces at the moment, or how that works, and what sort of patterns have you found with selling the fleeces? And then I would encourage everybody to post your questions or do a little dance to get my attention, and we'll open up the mics, of course. And just to reinforce what Elaine so shared, if you expect a bit of background noise, I guess it works better if we put ourselves on mute and then unmute if we want to contribute, because there's a large group of us here tonight, which is great to see. Yeah, so Sarah or Joe or Rachel, would you just explain how the fleeces work?
So the fleeces, we sell them as unwashed fleeces, and as described basically on the website. So that we'll photograph them, describe them, show some locks and how long the locks are, and so people can see the things like the crimp in them. And then as soon as generally people will select a particular fleece. We did think about just saying we've got 10 Polwarth fleeces or 10 Polwarth cross Corriedales, but there's still quite a bit of variation between the fleeces, and sometimes people want one that has slightly longer, or they want a slightly smaller fleece. So each one is individually sold, and I think part of the reason why we sort of went for the hand spinning market is that it can be quite personalized as well, because if people are going to buy a fleece that they're going to put hours in washing it, combing it, carding it, knitting it, then they want to know as much about it as possible. It's sort of joke sometimes that the sheep have had like a private education, and but they really like to know that the history and the provenance of the sheep, and that they've been outdoor bred and things like that. But they're sold individually, pretty much.
But you do sell them as an entire fleece, don't you?
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
As a fleece rather than breaking up the fleeces.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I think if there was more time, then and my job didn't take up so much time, then actually being able to do things like breaking up the fleece. Thanks for reminding me, Rachel. But yeah, breaking up the fleeces and selling by kilo, or washing some, maybe carding it or dyeing it, and being able to do a whole variety of different things with the fleece. Then maybe there'd be many more options. But we just sell it as whole fleeces.
Yeah, because we did look at getting some spun.
To
get, is it 100 kilos minimum, I think, or 200 kilos or something to get it spun, but it was going to be reasonably expensive to get it, like the mills, so it's a fair investment in money, but obviously then you can sell the wool for much more. But
and again, I think this is something that is, because there's a lot more smallholders that've got just a few sheep that they would like to have, they'd like to be able to have their sheep spun. And I think this is something from when I was in America. They have small mills that will just take 5 fleeces and turn that into yarn, and there really isn't anything like that here. Maybe I think there might be something in like the Isle of Uist or for sort of Harris tweed and things like that, but we did hunt around for something where it would be sort of smaller local mills, but they didn't really seem to exist. So anything that forwards that, I think, would be a great thing.
So there's a question here from Mike Beardmore. Is there a biobank? I'm not certain why I know what that is. Is that
that's in terms of genetics?
In terms of genetics, not that we're aware of anyway. In terms of fine wool, there's not. We've looked at various semen companies. We've spoken to the main sheep artificial breeding companies, and they don't have any fine wool semen like on store sort of thing that we could just buy.
Yeah, I was thinking that the microbrewing, craft brewing industry have found that by storing their varieties of yeast, and they actually have some intellectual property, and they can then license that out to other brewers for that particular variety, and that there's a possibility of having some intellectual property in the DNA of a particular variety, but also people will store it under nitrogen conditions, and so it can be reproduced over and over again. And I don't know if it's similar for sheep semen, but just an opportunity for an extra income stream, I'm thinking.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. It's an interesting comparison, and what we've got, of course, with sheep is breeding societies who do the sheep breeding development and you've got commercial entities, as Joe mentioned as well, which sells the semen. So yeah, that's I'll let Elbed, Sarah, Joe, Rachel to pick that up as well if there's any thoughts coming to your mind from Mike's comments. And I think you mentioned earlier, Joe, that's about the dual purpose, and that's just very much in focus now with Brexit, which tends to draw a lot of negativity. I think it was interesting you mentioned one positivity that might come from that process in relation to wool, but the effort to try and extract more income from wool possibly, and there's efforts going on here with trying to develop sheep dairying as well, and obviously the fourth being income, being environmental payment. So people are really interested to look at different sources of income from sheep, which we are so reliant in this area. Question from Rodri. Rodri Owen, you'll be able to see that on the chat. Are there any of your fine wool breeds that stand out in being able to thrive under the Northumberland conditions? And have you experienced any wool rot in heavy rainfall conditions? And last element of the question, how much will a raw fleece retail for? And I think Rodri maybe is doing his Christmas shopping early this year.
Let's hope. Yeah, so the fine wool breeds, as I say, we don't live in a particularly wet part of Britain, and we've not had any, even in the merinos, any fleece rot. I don't think at all in any of them, but it's something you do read about. And I know there's a lady down in Devon, which obviously Devon is a lot wetter than here, and she puts her sheep inside for the winter to keep them out of most of the rain. But yeah, all ours, even the pure merino, have not had any. But ours aren't the ultra fine. You can get really ultra fine merinos with a sort of 18, 19 micron, the Saxon merinos, and I think they're more susceptible to humidity and the fleece rot. And then but yeah. So hopefully that answers that question. And how much will a raw fleece retail? Well, sometimes up to what, 60, 80 quid, isn't it? Sarah?
Yeah, it's so we weigh each fleece, so each fleece is sort of is priced from the weight, and I think the pure merino is 20 pounds a kilo, and that they can be sort of 3 or 4 kilos in weight after it's been skirted, and then the cross breeds are the Polworths cross with Corriedales about, I think they're about 15 pounds a kilo. So again, there'll be sort of 3 or 4 kilos in weight in total. But compared to then the Hampshires, which is the Hampshire down fleece, is about 5 pounds a kilo. So that's so quite a bit cheaper for them. But that reflects the sort of the fineness of the wool and the extra work goes into it.
And also when Sarah's skirting the actual, compared to the wool that we'd send off to the wool marketing board, the skirting is quite a lot more. Well, I'm always horrified how much wool Sarah's chucking out, really.
Yeah, I definitely think that, and it's sort of for hand spinners, it's a kind of quality over quantity, and because we do price it by kilo as well. I think if if there's any horrid bits of that's that's around sort of the back end of the sheep, then those are all removed, because having to wash those bits is not that pleasant. But it's not waste. Any of those bits go on the vegetable patch, keep the slugs away, or on my allotment. So all of that sort of skirts the bad bits from a fleece. But yeah, we find that by being able to charge a kind of premium amount for the fine wool, it's down to the quality of the fleece and that they receive. They don't have to do a lot of work then to get the fleece cleaned up.
Your comment about quality aligns with the work that me and Jennifer did last year when we asked a number of crafters and manufacturers uses wool, what is the main consideration? And the number one by a clear mile was quality of the wool, defined by microns usually, or the fibre strength. And then the provenance was a second or a third in most people. However, if they were given the choice between the quality fleece from France and New Zealand and the quality fleece from local, they would go for local. However, quality was the dominant consideration when we did the research last year. Good. So I'll encourage some questions now, some general questions, whether they are for Elfed, who introduced to us Gwynedd, Gwlan Gwynedd a Mae'n, which is very active on Facebook, or Raburn Wool. And this is where maybe if you are following translations, you'll have to be quite nimble to go in and out, because the conversation might be going back off and on from English or Welsh now. But I know Rhiannon is doing an excellent job on the translation. So I'll just pick up some questions from the chat, and then I'll just see if there's anybody making signs. No? Okay, so I'll continue the chat. Rodri Oweno, he's he must be very interested. Is postage an issue? Okay, sorry, I thought it was postage for you, Rodri. But I guess in transporting and logistics of wool, yes, maybe if you could elaborate on that. That's for Raburn Wool. And also Yvonne asks, which fleece would you recommend for a beginner spinner? So if you could maybe share a response to those two questions.
Yeah, the postage, I mean, within the UK, sending a big fleece will probably cost about £10. We tend to kind of vacuum pack them down, and I do spend quite a bit of time stuffing wool into boxes and trying to get the parcel tape on quickly and before it all sort of expands out again. But it then gets sent, it'd be about £10 for one fleece within the UK. It's quite a lot more to send to America. It'd be about £30, £35. So, but it's not too much of an issue. We do have to, first sending abroad, we have to fill out a form to say it's raw wool. But so far, there's providing it's informed on the import-export forms, then that's fine. As far as what fleece to recommend for a beginner spinner, I would probably say something like a Romney, something that's quite a long wool is quite useful. Something like a Romney is quite useful. Is quite a nice one to spin. It's a good all-rounder fleece. It makes a really nice yarn. It's quite nice and stretchy, but it's also shiny. It's not going to be quite soft enough to wear next to the skin, but it'll hang beautifully. Any of the long wools, once it's spun up, it has beautiful drape, and it takes on the colours of dyes beautifully because there's a luster to it. So that's really nice. So it's something, and I think that one of my favourite wools is the Romney crossed with a merino, because it has the luster from the Romney, but it's just that bit softer as well. So that's a really nice wool to start with.
Can I just add what Sarah said?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, Rachel.
Sorry, just to add to Rodri's, the answer for Rodri about the postage is that we do that. The postage cost goes to the buyer. So the person buying the fleece takes on the cost of the postage.
That was exactly going to be my next question, how your business model works with delivery. Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you. Okay, so would anybody like to ask questions, direct to either of our guests tonight?
Just while people thinking the dual purpose nature. So our Romney cross, the Polworth cross Romneys, what we tend to do is keep them round for a full year, and we shear them early in the year in April time when they're about a year old, and then 2 or 3 weeks later sell them for meat. So we're getting 2 crops off the one lamb sort of thing, rather than which has been quite good, really.
Yeah, you do have to, you obviously sacrifice grass or you have them inside, but it's also the price of lamb is quite high in April, so you are compensated for having kept the lamb through till April, because you get a high price for the meat, but also then a beautiful fleece that comes off it.
And a first shearing fleece as well, which is also good.
I think this is a good point for me to flag up a project that AGW Byw will be supporting over the coming months with a group of farmers in South Gwynedd who will be receiving support to bring merino bloodlines to their flock to try and improve the wool quality, and got a lot of similarities, I think, with the approaches you've shared with us tonight from Raburn Wool, and for that reason, we might like to continue with the discussion after tonight as well. So that that's one way of tackling this issue, is to look at improving the wool quality from the existing flocks, and that will be a project we'll be kicking off over the next few weeks, and looking to bring bloodlines. Not exactly sure yet 100% with a plan, whether it be embryo transfers or live animals, but interestingly there is within that group of farmers a farmer who comes from the Falkland Islands originally as well, so that could I think that has influenced that project. So AGW Byw will be updating everybody how that project goes, but that's one way of approaching this sort of challenge we've got to add value to wool. Right, I've got a question from Jen. It's on the chat. Thanks for sharing your journey. Sounds very similar to us here at Pennod. I'm not sure whether you're aware of each other. Jen seconds most, if not all, of your comments. Great to see others adding value at shearing and selling direct. Can I ask if and where you get your fleeces micron tested?
Yeah, I can answer that. I'm afraid I work in a lab. I'm a scientist, so I took some of the fibre from the sheep and went and used a big, massive nanoscale microscope to measure, which was sort of to measure the micron. I mean, Joe, has there been any other recent?
Yeah, well, we've sent some to the chap. Tom Watson from Oleg Brannigan, the wool buyers. He and this may be something that Elvid could think of doing. He actually took some sheep away as well as some fleece, and he tested a lot of them. As whether it's something like if Elvid's setting up a wool cooperative sort of thing that could be a service, because it is reasonably tricky, to find. Well, that's what we found anyway. I didn't have a sister that was a scientist.
Yeah, I've moved labs now, so I don't have that ability anymore, which is a shame. But
and something that I think in this neck of the woods we highlighted in the report last year is the other organisations we've got based here. I know most of the people joining us tonight, we realised in Caernarfon, the World Testing Authority for the Northern Hemisphere is based. And we know that they can do micron testing, and also the Biocomposite Centre at the university. So we've got 2 leading labs who can do the measurements for wool on our doorstep, which is incredible, really, to have that potential link in the supply chain that we can work with. And this area has, we've got the expertise in the area to collaborate, and Courtney Pye from the World Testing Authority will be joining us next Monday. And Aled asks, sadly, because of the historic low value of the wool, breeding has focused on the meat, which I think you touched on, Joe, and much needs to change to reverse this trend. Any thoughts? And I'll kick off with Elfed maybe this time. Sut ti ryw feddyliau I gwestiwn Aled, and then I'll come back to Sarah, Rachel and Joe.
Well, rhywbeth dwi wastad wedi bod yn meddwl ydy, wrach oedd y gwestiwn bach yn wahanol o ffordd dwi'n atab, ond o fewn y busnes hi, dwi wedi bod yn meddwl am y ddafad Gymraeg yn benodol, lle. A'r ffordd oedd hwnna'n cael ei ddefnyddio i bob peth, ystalwm, ac y glân a'r cig. A un o'r rhesymau o'n eisiau sefydlu Gwlan Gwynedd y Môn oedd iddyn ni ganolbwyntio ar defnyddio gwlan o'r ddafad Gymreig. Ac dwi'n gwybod bod o'n wlan llawer iawn anoddach i weithio fo, yn enwedig pan mae'n dod i ochr y ffasiwn, lle, achos mae'n llawer iawn o, mi o ddim mor ffein a gwlan fatha Romney neu gwlan fatha Marino. Ond dwi yn meddwl fyswn ni yn gallu canolbwyntio ar y defad Cymreig sy'n gwneud y gwlan gorau ac wedyn, fatha o Aled yn dweud, fyswn ni'n gallu canolbwyntio ar y defad Cymreig sy'n a bridio nhw mwyn gallu gael y gwlan gorau nhw hefyd. Lle. A sy'n ni'n gallu ffeindio rhyw balans yn enwedig yn ardal yma i wneud arian o'r gwlan ac hefyd arian o'r cig. A dwi yn meddwl bod o'n bwysig canolbwyntio ar bryd fatha ddafad Gymraeg, jyst mwyn. Dwi yn berson sy'n licio haddodiadau. Felly, ond dwi yn meddwl mae yna modd gweithio fewn rhywbeth traddodiadol fel yma mwyn cael y bryd yn gry a cael y gorau allan o'r bryd hefyd. Gobeithio fyna rhyw ateb.
Hwna'n brydar. Ie, mae'n brydar dwi wedi clywed os ydy rhywun yn canolbwyntio gormod ar y gwlan, ydyn ni'n colli arian o'r cig coch ac yn cyrraedd o'r un lle yn diwedd, ynde? Wedyn yn ariannol economaidd wrth gwrs, wedyn mae'r balans yna'n rhan o'r ystyriaeth yn dod wrth drwy y pwysau mesur. So over to Raburn Wool, have you any thoughts in response to Aled's comments? So Sarah, Joe, Rachel, do you have any thoughts on Aled comments there, that how this focus on breeding for red meat, how do we respond to that challenge?
Yeah, I think it's tricky, and as Elvid says, in any breed there are big variations, and to choose, we've almost chosen against wool as an industry for certainly all the years I've been farming, in that sheep seem to be getting barer and barer. They're not breeding for less quantity of wool, definitely. The ones that make the highest prices have got the shortest, tightest skins, and then actually breeding away from wool. So when you look at the photos of the sheep 30, 40 years ago, they had a lot more wool on them, and that's partly because the wool has almost seemed like an inconvenience. I think a lot of sheep now have fallen between the two stools. I think really you need to have enough wool to make it worthwhile shearing them, or enough wool that's wanted, or no wool, and go to one of these wool shedding types of sheep. But I mean, we've had, like Elvid saying, Welsh sheep, we've had clins, and the clin wool's pretty canny, it varies, and it can be quite fine, just not very long. But where there's a Romney cross to clin adds a lot more, the actual staple length is longer.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether we've got someone joining us from Llŷn. I'm from Llŷn myself, and that breed is very versatile, and we nearly lost the breed about 40, 50 years ago, of course. And it's obviously made a big comeback by now. And Stephen asks, with being involved in selling inputs to farms, so Stephen is involved with that, I guess, specifically for meat, does feeding and what they eat have any effect on the wool quality? Now, that's a good question from Stephen.
No, though, I think the important thing is they don't have a check. So if, like Sarah, if we've ever had a sheep with mastitis or something like that that's been poorly or rough lambing, then you get all the sheep farmers here will have seen a sheep that slips its wool. If it has been poorly and then it gets thriving again, its wool, because the wool actually has almost a very thin part in it, and it snaps there, it has the break in it. So the important thing is at no point do they have a period of hardship or stress. They're sort of kept on a fairly even keel, and that helps stop those. Is there a word for them where that wool has the breaks?
We test each of the fleeces. We always test along the lock to make sure that there's no sort of weakened bit where it breaks. And I think that's probably, I don't know how regularly that happens, but we've never really had any fleeces that have done that. So I don't know whether that's as a result of all the grass that they're eating, but it's not something that we've ever really had a problem with, if fleeces that have got a sort of weakened line in the middle. It's still useful. We do sell wool, quite a lot of fleece sometimes to felters. So even if it was broken, there'd still be a market for it. It probably wouldn't be spinning, but there'd still be a market for it. But
and that's a question maybe we'll come back to next week, because I know the World Testing Authority are now developing a technique which they can measure the mean fibre diameter of the whole fibre, and by looking at that they can sort of make prediction of the stress on the animal during its sort of previous few months. So they're looking at applications for that test, which is interesting. Elwyn Vaughan has shared questions as well and comments. And I know Elwyn in his introduction mentioned the work he's been doing previously. Elwyn from Mae Raburn, he mentions that for something to have a benefit for most of Welsh farmers, it needs to have the emphasis on the Welsh mountain sheep. Lle mae'n cyd fynd ar pwyntiau, ti wedi bod yn dweud Elfed, yn y pwyntiau di fan'na, dydy. Ac efallai fod yna rhywbeth, dwi'n gwybod bod yna mwy nag un o Powys yn ymuno fyny heno, felly fod yn pwyslais hwn ar Arloes i Gwynedd y Môn, yna sicr lle i gydweithio, a dwi'n gwybod bod yna'r fforwm Gwlan ar hyn o bryd yn cael ei redeg gan y rhwydwaith Cymru Wledig, felly wrth gwrs mae rhaid i barhau siarad i gyd efo'n gilydd, neu mae peryg fyna bethau yn cael ei colli. Dear Rodri, there's a question there on the chat. Do you think the wearing of wool has become fashionable? Oh, has it become unfashionable? And what about feltedians? Yeah, I love my Swandry, but have not seen anything comparable here in Wales. We as farmers must be trendsetters, as Bloodstone goods are now in demand on the streets of London. That's a good point. Any response to that?
Na I fynd gyntaf os ydych chi isio?
Ie, na fo Elfed. Diolch yn fawr i ti.
Dwi'n meddwl bod o'n bwysig, rhyw ganrif yn ôl Gwlan oedd defnydd y bobl. Ac enghraifft, mae gol dwi eisiau gyrraedd ydy wneud carthenni Gwlan yn bethau mae bobl yn gallu fforddio a gwneud y broses yn lot mwy teg, sef fod yna lot mwy o yn hytrach na fod yr bobl sy'n dechrau'r broses yn cael rhyw swm bach o arian ac yna bobl diwedd y broses yn cael lwmp anfarth. Bod o'i gyd wedi cael ei wasgaru'n deg a fod yr carthenni ma'n fforddiadwy deuluodd. A dwi'n gobeithio dwi'n neud, mae gyda'i ffrind sy'n byw yn Sir Benfro ac yn fo garthenni Gwlan o'r 14th ganrif ar 15 ynddo. Bron iawn o 200 mlwydd oed a maen nhw'n edrych a nhw wedi cael eu prynu mewn siop ddoe. Felly dwi'n meddwl fod, mae'n rhywbeth am garthenni Gwlan yn wastad i bod yn atyniadol. A drwy wneud o'n fforddiadwy a drwy wneud y broses yn tegach, maen nhw'n mynd i ddod yn naturiol y fwy poblogaidd, dwi'n meddwl.
Ie, ardderchog am ddod. Mae gynnon ni bach o ryw sylwad, bach y tafod yn boch yn y sesiwn wythnos dwytha, lle da ni'n credu, debyg dwi'n meddwl i rhan o bethau mae Rodri ni archwilio fewn fo hyn ydy, os da ni yn wirioneddol credu mewn Gwlan yna, mae rhaid i ni fel bobl sydd wrach involved fel Gwlan fod yn arddel ac yn defnyddio'r deunydd, wrth gwrs. Felly mae'n bwys da. Anybody from Raburn would like to respond to Rodri?
Yeah, I also agree. I think wool's just fantastic. I love wearing wool. It's like wearing a hug, I think it's brilliant. I actually, whilst the farm is in Northumberland, I live in Scotland, in Glasgow, and it's been great to see recently how Harris tweed has had a real resurgence here, and is now a sort of, sort of protected and is seen, seen being worn a lot more. So that's brilliant.
Yeah, and we did a case study, if I remember, Jennifer did a case study on Kangaroo Island off Tasmania, and they were a good example of farmers who'd come together and branded the wool and made it very fashionable and appealing for people. So that's an interesting one for people to have a read, is Kangaroo Island, I think in South Australia or Tasmania. Thank you, Ellen, for the comment, and there's definitely room for more robust wools she shares with us. On the chat forum there. Thank you, diolch yn fawr Ellen o Abertawe from Swansea. And Aled, right, this is a big one. Would the tax on man-made fibres, on synthetic fibres, help the industry in your opinion? Elfed, ti eisiau trio taclo hwn gyntaf? Then we'll come back to Raburn.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought, isn't it? Having a tax on man-made fibres. I think the tide is turning as well a bit on man-made fibres now that there's much more evidence of the contamination of those microfibres that are found in seawater as a pollutant, and so maybe we can hope for something like that in the future. I'm always quite horrified about if I ever go into a shop and that most of the jumpers are all made out of plastic rather than being from wool, which is a far nicer, better, more durable product. But no, that's a really good idea.
Dwi'n meddwl hefyd, dwi'n cytuno hefyd, dwi'n meddwl bod o'n Mae yna ddau ran i chwarae, sef gwllwng pris yr pethau gwlan, neu ddim jyst gwllwng, ond gwneud am wyfforddiadwy, a hefyd rhoi trethu a codi y dreth ar pethau plastig. Ond mae yna lot mwy dwi'n meddwl mae eisiau trafod mwy efo'r cyhoedd hefyd fod yna chwarae'r rhan. Achos fod llawer iawn o bobl rwan yn nes nhw'n prynu cynnyrch oherwydd ei effaith ar yr amgylchedd. A mae cneifio dafad, mae bobl sy'n mynd bita cig weithio'n edrych ar cneifio dafad. Mae yna rhai bobl sy'n mynd bita cig a mae yna rhain wrach yn meddwl bod cneifio hefyd yn greulon i'r anifal. Ond mae cneifio rhywbeth dyn ni'n gorfod wneud. Dyn ni'n cael arian da amdano fo wan, ond mae rhywbeth dyn ni'n gorfod wneud mwyn lles yr anifal. A hefyd drwy siarad fo bobl yn dweud, wel mae hwn yn byproduct wrth i ni helpu'r anifal. Mae o'n rhywbeth fysa'n hefyd wrach jyst yn cael mwy o'r cyhoedd ar ein ochr ni yn y pen draw. Dwi'n bwysleisio ar ochr gwyrdd yno fo.
Ie, diolch o'r pwyntiau da fyna. A wedi drio cloi y sesiwn rwan efo'r ddau gwestiwn nesaf. So I'll be bringing the session to a close over the next few minutes taking these two final questions. One from Rodri is asking, would the hard, rough wool from the Welsh mountain sheep, would that be suitable for felted yarns? And he's aware that that is used to make work clothes like the swan tree. And then Tarian Mair, a particular question for Elfed. Does he know approximately how many fleeces goes to make one roll of insulation? And maybe, Elfed, you'll have to define what is a roll of insulation for us as well, for us to get an idea with that question. Felly, cyn mi ofyn chi ateb y ddau gwestiwn yna, mi fydd y sesiwn wythnos nesaf am 7:00 ar y fforwm Zoom. Felly, mae croeso chi gael y link sydd yna, neu mae modd i chi gofrestru yn union yr un ffordd, ond eto chi gofrestru ar gyfer hwn trwy Eventbrite. Falle bod chi eisiau amlygu y sesiynau efo rai o'ch cysylltiadau chi, achos da ni eisiau ehangu'r drafodaeth. Achos mewn bythefnos i heno, y 4yd sesiwn, mi fydda ni cael trafodaeth hollol agorad lle fydda ni trio hwyluso sesiwn i ddod i fyny ac i amlygu cynlluniau posib i'w cefnogi o dan cynllun líder yng Ngwynedd a Môn. I drio symud yr agenda ymlaen efo Gwlan. Felly, fydd y sesiwn yna'n sesiwn bwysig iawn ac yn flaenllaw iawn o ran gosod yr agenda o ran arloesi Gwynedd wedig ac arloesi Môn. So, going back to those two questions, Sarah, Rachel, and Joe, how would you respond to Rodri's idea? Then we'll finish off with Elbert.
Certainly, I'm not aware of any commercial felting being done, and if it was done, I'd happily buy the next Welsh swan dry made from felted Welsh mountain wool rather than New Zealand wool. It seems like a good use for that, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Diolch o galon. A Gelfed, dwi'n gweld bod chi wedi ateb y cwestiwn. Jennifer sydd wedi rhannu bach o ymateb o fanna, de. Wedyn ar ran y cwestiwn sawl cnu mewn rôl o ddeunydd ynysu, be ydy'r ymateb di hwnnw?
Wel, jyst i edrych yn fawr, dibynnu pa bryd o ddafad. Efo'r ddafad Gymreig, achos fod o'n gnu eitha ddim o'r ddwys rwysyd ar cneuau eraill. Mae'n tueddu i gael lot mwy angen lot mwy o gnyd i fod mewn metr sgwar o insulation. Ac dwi wedi bod yn gwneud gwaith ymchwil hyn o bryd i'r fathau wahanol o wlan Dwi'n credu hyn o bydd fyddai yn defnyddio'r gwlan dafod Gymreig o fewn installation, ond hefyd defnyddio dipyn o waith y wlan dafod oedd llun hefyd, ac i dod bach o'r omnis dibynnu be sy'n gweithio orach, os ar hyn o bryd gyda ni aelod o'r tîm sy'n wyddonydd, ac mi o'n mynd i helpu ni neu bach o brofion i weld pa un di'r gwlan gorau fe fewn i'r installation, tra fysa'r compost ei hun ochr yna'r busnes yn cael ei wneud efo gwlan dafod Gymreig yn benodol.
Diolch o galon. And thank you also, Mike. I didn't see that originally. Thank you for sharing the web link for the Museum of English Rural Life, which has an archive of sheep history as well, which some of us might want to follow up. So thank you very much for that. Wel, mae'n bod yn blesar cael gwrando ac ar y sgwrs heno a'r cwestiynau. I will be, so if I can ask one last question to the Henrys and to Elfed, would you have one sort of final thought you'd like to share with us as a group, as sort of a tip or one piece of advice as we try to come up with possible solutions, new ideas with adding value to wool? Because in 2 weeks' time we've been sort of looking to identify ideas, and the reason for hosting this session tonight was to learn from you. So maybe just one piece of advice, and maybe you're of the age, maybe Elfed isn't, but the Henrys might remember Jerry Springer and the show, and he used to have a little section right at the end, Jerry's final thought. So we're going to have the Henrys' final thought and Elfed's final thought on this challenge of trying to extract more value from the world, and then obviously the bigger picture is to have a stronger rural economy. Diolch o galon i chi gyd am ymuno efo ni. Unwaith oedden ni clywed gan y gwrandawyr gwesteion ni fyddai pasio nôl i Elin. Felly, who'd like to respond to that on behalf of the Henrys?
Okay, I think our final thought is keep open-minded, give anything a go. I think we definitely get the feeling that there is really increased interest in wool. This is an industry that's very much on the rise at the moment, and so to get involved in anything to do with wool is a very, very positive thing for a lot of reasons, but also we feel that it is a movement that's just starting and it's going to get bigger and bigger.
Sarah, did you want to come in?
I was pretty much gonna say the same. I think there's a big rise of interest in wool at the moment, and for me, I think as well, the thing that I really enjoy the process of working with wool. I like washing it and combing it. I love spinning wool. For me, it's like meditation. It's sort of the world, coronavirus, all of that drifts away. It's so relaxing. It's wonderful. So that would be another thing. But I think there's a real interest and a resurgence in raw wool again, which is brilliant.
Great, diolch yn fawr, thank you Sarah. Ac Elfed?
Jyst i ychwanegu, dwi'n cytuno'n iawn beth yn gryb ar yr Henrys dweud, ond jyst i feddwl hefyd, i ni sylweddoli faint o potensial sgennym ni, ac i droi wbeth da ni'n gweld fatha problem wan mewn wbeth fydd yn gallu cynnal y dyfodol i'n cenhedlaeth i a'r cenhedlaethau nesaf, ac fod gwlan yn mynd i fod yn chwarae rhan allweddol, nid yn unig yn adeiladu'r economi Gymreig, ond hefyd rôl o fewn arlwyfan y byd hefyd, ynddo? Achos fod ni'n tueddu symud mwy o'n oddi wrth yr pethau, y plastigion yma. Fysa gwlan yn gallu llenwi hwnna dda iawn, gwlan ac rhyw ddefnyddio gwyrdd eraill. Mae yna potensial anhygoel iddyn nhw.
Ie, cytuno. A dwi'n siŵr o pawb yn cyd-fynd efo'r sylwadau positif hefyd, ac do'r her ydi gwireddu'r y potensial sydd gan gwlan wrth gwrs, a fydde mond yn un edmygedd at y Elfed a'r teulu Henrys am symud o ddeud i gwneud. Mae hwnna wastad yn her, a trio ymrafal ar her ma sydd ar yn dwylo ni. Ac cyd-fynd efo sylwadau Sarah, mae gweu, dwi'n siŵr o gweu yn relaxing, ond mae edrych ar ei bon yn ystod y nos wedi bod yn relaxing yn gweu. Felly dwi'n siŵr fod yn fod pleserus. Diolch o galon i bawb am ymuno ac yn Rhiannon am gyfieithu, Ond fydda i rwan yn pasio'r owena, munud i fynd cyn hanner diwedd, a diolch o galon i chi bawb am ymuno fyny ar nos Lun, a fyddwn ni yma eto nos Lun nesa a'r nos Lun wedyn. Felly ymledwch y gair am y trafodaethau gwlan yma, ac gawn ni weld lle lleith y daith yma, lle nôl at Elin.
Diolch fawr iawn, Geraint, a diolch am drefnu hynno a cyflwyno hefyd. Ac o'n i jyst eisiau ychwanegu at y diolch am ti wedi rhoi yn barod lle. Diolch i Elfed, Sarah, Jo a Rachel hefyd. Oedd o rili difyr dysgu. Dwi'n dysgu mwy bob wsos, rili. Ac o'n i hefyd i anghofio am coronavirus tan i Sarah sôn gyna. So mae'n amlwg bod o'n difyr.